The morning sun was harsh, and the streets of downtown Chicago were already alive with activity. Jamal, a 15-year-old boy, was on his knees methodically sweeping the sidewalk outside a bustling cafe. The broom in his hands was old, its bristles frayed, but Jamal treated it like a tool of pride. He had been at it since dawn, ensuring the stretch of pavement was spotless before the cafe's rush of customers. As he worked, he noticed a sleek silver sports car pulling up near the curb, its engine purring like a predator. He barely glanced at it, focusing instead on clearing a pile of fallen leaves near the car. The dust swirled into the air as he swept, and in a twist of bad luck, a gust of wind carried it toward the car just as the driver stepped out. "Hey!" barked a sharp voice. Jamal turned quickly, his heart skipping a beat. Standing in front of him was a tall, sharply dressed man, his suit screaming wealth and power. The man dusted off his sleeve with exaggerated annoyance, his face twisting in disgust. "Are you blind, kid, or just stupid?" the man snapped, his voice cutting through the morning chatter. I'm sorry, sir," Jamal stammered, stepping back and clutching the broom. "It was an accident. I didn't mean to—" "Accident?" the man interrupted, his voice rising. By now, heads were turning. Cafe patrons sipping their lattes began to watch, phones discreetly aimed at the scene. "This is a $5,000 suit? Do you have any idea what you've done?" "I'm really sorry, sir," Jamal said again, his voice barely audible. His fingers tightened around the broom as humiliation crept over him. The man scoffed, looking Jamal up and down. "You think a sorry from a nobody like you fixes anything? Look at you, a kid playing janitor sweeping trash like your life depends on it. Is this all you aspire to?" Jamal's face burned, but he said nothing. His father had always told him to rise above moments like this. "Silence speaks louder than words," his dad used to say. But today, the silence felt heavy, oppressive. "Maybe if you tried as hard at life as you do at cleaning the sidewalk, you wouldn't be here," the man added, his words dripping with contempt. A few people in the cafe gasped while others murmured in discomfort. Still, no one intervened. The man was about to walk away when he added one final blow. "Some people are just born to clean up after the rest of us." As the man strutted toward the cafe entrance, a sudden hush fell over the street. 3 black SUVs rolled up to the curb in perfect synchronization, their dark windows gleaming ominously in the sunlight. The car doors opened with a soft click, and 3 imposing men stepped out, each dressed in tailored black suits. They scanned the street like hawks before their eyes settled on the cafe and the man in the silver sports car. One of the men, tall with a military-like posture, approached the cafe entrance. His presence was magnetic, and people instinctively stepped out of his way. He leaned into the cafe, speaking to the waiter in a calm but firm voice. "Who owns the silver sports car outside?" The waiter, startled, pointed toward the man who had humiliated Jamal moments earlier. "That's him," he said nervously. The suited man nodded and walked back toward the SUVs. The other 2 men exchanged looks before one of them approached Jamal. He handed the boy a small card, his expression unreadable. "Hold on to this," he said quietly. "You'll understand soon." Jamal looked at the card, confused. It was plain black with just a phone number and the initials of the name CB. Meanwhile, inside the cafe, the man who had humiliated Jamal sat comfortably, oblivious to the SUVs outside. He was laughing loudly, speaking to someone on his phone. You see, the problem with people today is that they're too soft. You've got to be ruthless to get ahead. These kids today, they don't have what it takes to make it. But as he laughed, several cafe patrons glanced nervously out the window. The SUVs were still there, and the suited men seemed to be waiting for something. Or someone. Jamal stood frozen on the sidewalk, clutching the small black card in his trembling hands. The initials CB and the mysterious phone number seemed to pulse with an energy of their own, like a riddle waiting to be solved. He glanced at the SUVs again, their occupants now leaning casually against the vehicles, but their eyes constantly scanning the cafe. It felt like the calm before a storm, though Jamal couldn't fathom what he had stumbled into. Inside the cafe, Richard Townsend lounged at a corner table, exuding the smug confidence of a man who believed he owned the world. He had just ordered an overpriced espresso and was in the middle of a phone call with his business associate. His voice carried across the room, loud enough for everyone to hear. "The thing is," Townsend said, swirling his cup lazily, "you can't coddle these people. If they're struggling, it's because they lack ambition. That's why I don't waste my time on handouts. You give them an inch, and they think they deserve the world." The waiter, who had overheard the conversation earlier between Townsend and Jamal, clenched his jaw but said nothing as he served the coffee. Several patrons exchanged uneasy glances, their discomfort palpable. Outside, Jamal couldn't bring himself to leave. Something about the men in the SUVs felt significant, as if they were connected to the strange humiliation he had just endured. One of the men, the one who had handed him the card, caught his gaze and gave him a nod, not threatening, but knowing. It sent a shiver down Jamal's spine. At that moment, another black SUV turned the corner and parked in front of the cafe. This one seemed different, larger, newer, and with tinted windows so dark that they reflected the world like a mirror. The cafe patrons noticed the car immediately, their murmurs growing louder. Even Richard paused mid-sentence to glance outside. "What's with all the black cars today?" he muttered, irritated, as he sipped his espresso. The door of the newest SUV opened slowly, and a man stepped out. He was older, in his late 50s, with salt and pepper hair and a presence that demanded attention. He wore a tailored gray suit, and his sharp eyes took in the scene with quiet intensity. He walked toward Jamal, his footsteps deliberate. When he reached the boy, he crouched slightly to meet his eyes. "Are you Jamal?" the man asked, his voice calm but commanding. Jamal blinked, unsure how to respond. Yes, sir," he stammered. "I'm Jamal." The man smiled faintly, though there was an edge to it. "You remind me of someone I used to know," he said softly, almost to himself. He straightened up and gestured toward the cafe. "Is that the man who insulted you?" Jamal hesitated, looking toward the cafe's large window. Through the glass, Townsend was scrolling on his phone, oblivious to the world outside. "Yes, sir," Jamal finally said, his voice quiet. The older man nodded, his expression unreadable. "Stay here," he said, placing a reassuring hand on Jamal's shoulder. Then, with a measured pace, he walked toward the cafe entrance, the suited men from the SUVs falling into step behind him. The cafe grew silent as the older man entered, his presence like a storm cloud sweeping across a sunny sky. The staff paused mid-action, and the customers whispered nervously. Richard Townsend finally looked up, annoyed at the interruption. "Can I help you?" Townsend said, his tone dripping with impatience. The older man didn't answer immediately. He walked up to Townsend's table, his gaze unwavering. When he spoke, his voice was calm but carried an authority that made everyone in the room sit up straighter. "Richard Townsend," the man began. "It's not every day I find myself standing in front of a man who thinks he's above others, a man who believes his wealth makes him better than the people around him." Townsend frowned, glancing nervously at the suited men who had flanked the older man. "Who are you, and what's this about?" The man leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the table. "Let's just say I'm someone who doesn't take kindly to arrogance, especially when it's directed at people who work harder in a day than you do in a month." Richard scoffed, regaining some of his bravado. "Listen, I don't know who you think you are, but—" "Clarence Bennett," the man interrupted, his name landing like a thunderclap in the room. The cafe fell into stunned silence. Several patrons exchanged wide-eyed glances, whispering to each other. Clarence Bennett was a billionaire philanthropist and a civil rights advocate whose name was synonymous with power and justice. He wasn't just wealthy, he was influential in ways that Richard could only dream of. Richard's smirk faltered. "Mr. Bennett, I don't understand." "You don't have to," Clarence said, cutting him off again. His voice hardened, his calm demeanor giving way to a steely edge. "What I understand is that you humiliated a young man outside this cafe, a young man who, unlike you, knows the value of hard work." Richard's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "It was just a misunderstanding," he said quickly. "I didn't mean anything by it." Clarence straightened up, his gaze cold. "You didn't mean anything by it? That's exactly the problem with people like you. You think your words don't carry weight, but they do. And today, you're going to learn just how heavy they can be." Clarence gestured to one of his men who handed him a folder. He placed it on the table in front of Richard. "This is a list of every unethical business practice your company has engaged in over the past 5 years. Tax evasion, worker exploitation, environmental violations, you name it." Richard's eyes widened in shock. "How did you?" "It doesn't matter how I know," Clarence said sharply. "What matters is what I'm going to do with this information if you don't make things right." The room was thick with tension. Richard Townsend stared at the folder on the table, his face pale. The list of offenses Clarence Bennett had presented wasn't just damning, it was career-ending. For the first time in years, Richard felt genuinely out of control. "You can't just walk in here and throw accusations like this," Richard said, his voice shaky but defiant. "This is harassment. I'll have my lawyers deal with you." Clarence raised an eyebrow, his calm demeanor almost unnerving. "Your lawyers?" He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Richard, the difference between you and me is that I don't need lawyers to handle my business. When I decide someone's actions need consequences, I deliver them myself." The patrons in the cafe were riveted, phones out, capturing every second. Clarence wasn't just addressing Richard, his words carried weight, a lesson directed at anyone watching. And they were all watching. Just as Clarence leaned back preparing to deliver the final blow, a quiet but firm voice cut through the tension. "Excuse me, Mr. Bennett?" Everyone turned. It was Jamal, standing hesitantly at the doorway. He had followed Clarence and his men inside, his broom still clutched tightly in his hands. The boy's eyes darted nervously around the room, but there was a determination in his gaze. Clarence turned toward him, his expression softening. "Yes, Jamal." Jamal swallowed hard, stepping forward. I appreciate you standing up for me, but I don't want this to become about revenge. My dad used to say that when you fight fire with fire, everyone gets burned." The room fell silent. Even Richard looked stunned, his arrogant demeanor momentarily replaced by genuine surprise. "Jamal, your father was a wise man," Clarence said after a moment, his voice quieter now. "But sometimes, standing up to people like this isn't about revenge. It's about ensuring they don't hurt others." Jamal nodded slowly but held his ground. "I understand, sir. But I also think people like him don't change because they're punished. They change when they understand the harm they've caused." The weight of Jamal's words hung in the air, and for the first time, Clarence hesitated. The young boy had challenged him, not out of defiance but from a place of integrity. Richard stared at Jamal, something in the boy's courage striking a chord deep within him, something he didn't want to admit. The kid had every reason to hate him, yet here he was, advocating for understanding. I didn't mean to hurt you," Richard said, his voice low. It wasn't much, but it was the first time he had acknowledged Jamal directly since the incident. "I've been under a lot of pressure. That's not an excuse, but—" He stopped, struggling to find the words. Clarence, ever perceptive, seized the moment. "Pressure? That's what you're going with?" He gestured to Jamal. "This boy works before school every day, scraping by to help his mother make ends meet. You think he doesn't feel pressure? And yet, look at how he carries himself, with dignity. Can you say the same?" Richard flinched but didn't respond. The crowd watched intently, murmuring among themselves. The story unfolding before them wasn't just about a wealthy man and a poor boy. It was about accountability, humility, and the power of doing what's right. Clarence turned back to the crowd, his voice rising slightly. "It's easy to look down on someone when you've forgotten where you came from. But let me remind you, Richard, you didn't start at the top. You worked your way up, just like Jamal is doing now." The reminder hit Richard like a punch to the gut. Memories of his own difficult childhood, selling newspapers on cold mornings and working late nights to save for college flashed through his mind. He had buried those memories beneath years of luxury and success, convincing himself they no longer mattered. As Clarence's words settled, one of the cafe patrons stood up. "I think it's time you apologized," she said, her voice firm but calm. Others began nodding in agreement, their voices growing louder. "Apologize," someone called out. "Make it right." Richard's face reddened as he realized he was cornered. His instinct was to push back, to defend his actions, but Jamal's words lingered in his mind. Could he really justify his behavior to this boy, to this room full of witnesses? Slowly, Richard stood. The cafe fell silent once more. He turned to Jamal, his posture stiff but his expression uncharacteristically vulnerable. "I'm sorry," Richard said, his voice clear but strained. "What I said to you earlier was wrong. It was cruel, and it came from a place of arrogance. You didn't deserve that." Jamal looked at him, searching his face for sincerity. After a long moment, he nodded. "Thank you." But Clarence wasn't done. "Words are a good start, Richard," he said, his tone firm, "but actions matter more. If you're truly sorry, you'll do something to make amends." Richard hesitated, then reached for his wallet. He pulled out a business card and handed it to Jamal. "This is my company," he said. "If you ever need a job, call me. I'll make sure you have a place there." Jamal looked at the card, then up at Richard. "Thank you, sir, but I don't need charity. I'll earn my place just like my dad taught me." The boy's words struck a chord not just with Richard but with everyone in the cafe. Clarence smiled, proud of Jamal's unwavering integrity. As the tension eased, one of Clarence's men leaned in and whispered something in his ear. Clarence's smile faded slightly, and he turned back to Jamal. "You've handled yourself well today," Clarence said, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "But I have a feeling this is only the beginning. Stay strong." Jamal frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" Clarence didn't answer, but the look in his eyes hinted at something deeper, something unresolved. The crowd watched as he and his men exited the cafe, leaving behind a room full of questions. As the black SUVs disappeared into the morning traffic, the cafe slowly returned to its usual hum. Jamal stood near the doorway, still clutching the business card Richard Townsend had offered him. The tension in the air had eased, but the weight of what had just happened lingered. Richard remained at his table, staring down at his empty espresso cup, his usual bravado replaced by an uneasy quiet. He felt the stares of the cafe patrons burning into him. The humiliation wasn't lost on him, but something deeper had stirred, a reflection he had long avoided. Jamal quietly left the cafe, walking back to his broom and dustpan. He had work to finish, and his mother always said, "No matter what happens, never leave a job undone." He began sweeping again, his movements steady, but his thoughts racing. Inside, Richard watched him through the cafe window. For the first time in years, he felt something he didn't recognize: guilt. He couldn't shake the boy's words, or Clarence's scathing reminder of his own humble beginnings. He had spent so much time clawing his way to the top that he'd forgotten what it felt like to be at the bottom. One of the patrons, a middle-aged woman who had recorded the entire incident on her phone, approached Richard. "You know," she said, her tone sharp but not unkind, "the whole world's going to see that video. You can't take back what you did, but you can decide what happens next." Richard looked at her, his jaw tightening. "What are you suggesting?" She shrugged. "Maybe it's time you remembered what it's like to help someone instead of tearing them down." Meanwhile, outside, Jamal was about to finish his shift when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned to see Richard standing there, looking uncharacteristically awkward. The cafe patrons were watching from inside, their faces pressed against the glass like an audience waiting for the final act. "Jamal," Richard began, his voice softer than before, "I owe you more than just an apology. I didn't just insult you. I insulted the values you stand for. Hard work, dignity, things I lost sight of a long time ago." Jamal blinked, unsure of how to respond. This wasn't the same man who had berated him earlier. There was something raw, almost vulnerable in Richard's tone. Richard hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek black checkbook. "Let me help you," he said, "not as charity, but as an investment. You have a spark, kid. I can see it. Use this to build something for yourself, something your father would be proud of." He scribbled on the check, tore it off, and handed it to Jamal. The boy stared at it, his eyes widening as he saw the amount: $50,000. Jamal began, but he couldn't find the words. "Take it," Richard insisted. "You've earned it more than I deserve to give it." Before Jamal could respond, a car horn blared from the street. He turned to see his mother stepping out of a cab, her face a mix of confusion and worry. "Jamal, what's going on here?" Jamal ran to her, holding out the check. "Mom, look! This man, he's helping us." His mother took the check, her eyes scanning the amount. She looked up at Richard, her expression unreadable. "Why?" she asked simply. Richard sighed, his shoulders sagging slightly. "Because it's the least I can do to make up for the way I treated your son, and because I see myself in him. I want to do better." For a long moment, Jamal's mother said nothing. Then, with a small smile, she handed the check back. "We appreciate the gesture, but we don't need handouts. What my son needs is an opportunity, not a blank check." Richard was stunned. He looked at Jamal, who nodded in agreement. "She's right," Jamal said. "I want to earn my way." Richard stood there holding the rejected check, feeling an odd mixture of respect and shame. He realized this moment wasn't about money. It was about redemption, about proving to himself and others that he could be more than his mistakes. "All right," he said finally. "If it's opportunity you want, then I'll give you one. Come to my office tomorrow after school. We'll figure something out." Jamal smiled, his confidence growing. "Thank you, sir. I won't let you down." As Richard walked back to the cafe, the patrons clapped softly, acknowledging his effort to make amends. But the work wasn't over, for Richard or Jamal. That evening, Jamal sat with his mother at their small kitchen table. The black card the man in the SUV had given him lay between them. Jamal hadn't thought much about it in the chaos of the day, but now curiosity gnawed at him. "Should I call it?" he asked. His mother frowned slightly but nodded. "It's worth knowing what it's about." Jamal dialed the number, his heart pounding. After a few rings, a calm, familiar voice answered. "Jamal," said Clarence Bennett, "I was hoping you'd call." "How do you know my name?" Jamal asked, his voice tinged with surprise. Clarence chuckled softly. "I knew your father. He was one of the finest men I ever had the honor of working with. When I heard about what happened today, I couldn't stay away. You remind me of him, you know." Jamal's throat tightened. "You knew my dad?" "Yes," Clarence said. "And I want you to know, if you ever need anything at all, you can count on me." The next day, Jamal showed up at Richard's office, broom in hand. When Richard saw him, he laughed for the first time in a long while. "You won't need that here," he said, motioning for Jamal to come inside. Over the months that followed, Jamal worked part-time for Richard's company, learning the ropes of business and discovering a world he'd only dreamed of. With Clarence's quiet guidance in the background, Jamal began to build something remarkable, not just for himself, but for his community. Richard, for his part, found himself changing. Slowly, the lessons he had once scoffed at began to shape him into a better man, and though he still had a long way to go, he knew he was finally on the right path. Months turned into a year, and Jamal's life transformed in ways he could have never imagined. He balanced his part-time role at Richard Townsend's company with school and his sidewalk sweeping job. To the surprise of everyone, Jamal didn't quit cleaning the streets, even when Richard offered to pay him a full-time salary. "It keeps me grounded," Jamal explained when Richard asked, "and it reminds me where I started." Richard nodded, silently admiring the boy's humility. Working with Jamal had been an unexpected lesson for Richard himself. The young boy's determination, integrity, and refusal to take shortcuts had forced Richard to confront his own flaws. Over time, Richard began to make changes, not just in how he treated others, but in how he ran his business. Under Jamal's influence, Richard launched a new program at his company, a mentorship initiative for underprivileged youth. He recruited professionals to train young people like Jamal, giving them a chance to learn skills and build careers. The initiative gained widespread attention, even earning praise from Clarence Bennett himself. "I never thought I'd say this," Clarence remarked during a press interview, "but Richard Townsend is proving that redemption is possible. His actions speak louder than his words ever did." For Jamal, the mentorship program became more than an opportunity. It became his mission. He used the skills he learned at Richard's company to start a small community initiative, helping kids in his neighborhood find part-time jobs and stay out of trouble. He called it the Sweepers Network, a nod to his roots. One day, as Jamal was wrapping up a meeting with his new team of volunteers, he received an unexpected visitor. Clarence Bennett walked into the room, his presence as commanding as ever. "Mr. Bennett!" Jamal exclaimed, standing to greet him. "Just Clarence," the older man said with a smile. He looked around the modest office space Jamal had set up, his eyes filled with pride. "You've done well for yourself, Jamal. Your father would be proud." Jamal's throat tightened at the mention of his dad. "Thank you, sir. That means a lot coming from you." Clarence handed Jamal an envelope. "I've been watching your progress. Inside is a grant to help expand your program. Use it wisely." Jamal opened the envelope, his eyes widening as he saw the amount: $100,000. "Sir, I don't know what to say," Jamal stammered. "You've already said enough," Clarence replied. "Now go prove what you're capable of." At the same time, Richard was sitting in his office staring at an old photograph he had recently uncovered. It was a picture of himself as a young boy, standing outside a rundown diner where he used to work. His hands were dirty, his clothes tattered, but his eyes were full of hope. The photograph stirred something deep within him. He realized that the fire that had driven him to succeed had turned into arrogance somewhere along the way. Jamal had reminded him of that boy in the photograph, the boy who once believed in hard work and kindness. For the first time in years, Richard felt a sense of peace. He picked up his phone and dialed a number. "Jamal," he said when the boy answered, "I just wanted to thank you." "For what?" Jamal asked, surprised. "For showing me what really matters," Richard said simply. Months later, Richard and Jamal attended the launch of a new community center, funded by Richard's company and Clarence Bennett's foundation. The center was dedicated to Jamal's father, honoring his legacy as a firefighter who had given his life to help others. During the ceremony, Jamal stood at the podium, addressing a crowd of hundreds. His voice was steady, his words powerful. "My father always said that success isn't measured by what you take, but by what you give back. Today, I stand here because of the people who believed in me and taught me that even in the face of humiliation or hardship, you can rise above it and make a difference." The crowd erupted into applause, but Jamal's eyes sought out two people in the audience: Clarence Bennett and Richard Townsend. Both men nodded, their expressions filled with pride. After the ceremony, Richard found himself alone on the balcony of the community center, gazing at the sunset. Jamal joined him, the two standing in comfortable silence for a moment. "You've changed a lot," Jamal said eventually. Richard smiled faintly. "I had a good teacher." Jamal grinned. "I think you're giving me too much credit." Richard shook his head. "Not at all. You taught me something I forgot a long time ago. Success is hollow if you don't use it to lift others." Jamal looked out at the horizon, his heart full. "My dad would have liked you, you know." Richard's smile widened, and for the first time he felt like he was finally living up to the man he had always wanted to be. The story concludes with a powerful message. Redemption and growth are possible, no matter how far you've strayed. Success is not just about wealth or power, but about using what you have to uplift others. And sometimes the greatest lessons come from the most unexpected people.